DTM, of course, has a vast footprint. We have 440 experts, 6,200 field enumerators who talk to over 166,000 key informants each year. This last year, there was a tracking of over 25 million internally displaced people, 16 million IDP returnees, 5 million returnees from abroad in over 78 countries. So it's certainly a vast tool. And with such broad range of operations, it's a responsibility for us to share information. And that's one reason why we're hosting this discussion today. To this end, IOM has established and co-leads since 2018 the Humanitarian Data Science and Ethics Group, or DSEG. Over the last decade, the humanitarian sector has undergone enormous shifts in how it handles data. I could tell stories of 25 years ago on how difficult it was to get anywhere and how I was unsuccessful in developing data gathering mechanisms, but we've progressed well past that now. Moreover, the number of data collection initiatives has grown exponentially. This coincides with the development and uptake of mobile data collection tools, crowdsourcing, big data, and more accessible remote sensing data. These different data acquisition modalities, along with improved assessment capacity, means that numerous data sets can be produced for any given response. It also means that these data sets are more accessible through data sharing agreements and open data platforms, such as the Humanitarian Data Exchange. To summarize the current state of humanitarian data, there is more of it than ever before. It's more robustly collected. It's better structured, thus being more interoperable and machine readable, and it's more accessible. All of this is a huge success for the sector as it allows for greater transparency and accountability of the decisions made using data. It also creates an enabling environment for the inception of more advanced data science to be applied to humanitarian programs. Subsequently, we are seeing more data-enhanced humanitarian programs across the sector. A few examples include using data to predict patterns of human movement during natural disasters, using artificial intelligence to detect structures damaged by natural disasters in satellite images, predicting famine in high-risk countries, and examining the effect of human movement on disease transmission. Most recently, we used data in camps to do scenario planning for COVID and how it would affect camp populations. Use that to design. Data responsibility and ethics has become a strategic priority. We are aware of issues with regards to data responsibility in various spheres of life, which naturally impact the humanitarian sector. Therefore, it would be irresponsible if we only engaged in data collection, data science, and adoption of new technologies without investing in ethics. Data science, including AI and other emerging technologies, have proven to be enormously powerful and effective. However, we must understand the risks of using such methods and tools in complex environments that humanitarians operate in. Various stakeholders, including governments, the UN, NGOs, and civic society, are dealing with the same challenges. We must commit to coordinate and collectively learn how to realize the potential and recognize the risks of new technologies and data science methods. The DSEG is already working towards this by creating an informal community, we're a part of it here, publishing the framework for the ethical use of advanced data science methods in the humanitarian sector, published in April 2020, and launching the DSEG Decision Tree, an interactive tool designed to guide humanitarians through the data science journey to hopefully mitigate a lot of the risks. I'm now going to pass the floor to Nuno Nunes, my colleague, the Global DTM Coordinator, who will give you some more background on this before we give a presentation of the tool. My pleasure.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Rob and colleagues, for this opportunity today. I think that to start, Jeff already introduced quite a bit of the work of DTM and the networks. I would just mention how important it is to link our work our concerns, the way that we look at technological opportunities, also with discussions from senior institutional management. And in that regard, this very, very important, and I'm very thankful that Jeff, as Director of Operations and Emergencies for IOM, has engaged so strongly. I think that as a background, there were two big reasons for IOM or for DTM to engage on this work. One, it was a bit of a puzzle, like from a management perspective, to try to understand or manage development teams across areas of data science, data collection, data sharing, etc., in such a regulated environment. And in that regard, we needed somehow to find a bit of guidance that didn't exist. So Rob and many other colleagues, Kate and others, initiated this group, DSEG, and I'm really thankful for how productive I think this group has been in terms of defining between the different participants what would be practical and useful tools and frameworks that we could use as IOM, but also that I believe with everyone's engagement have been seen as useful for others. So with this, I think that maybe I'll stop here and just pass it to Rob to start the big discussions, and thank you very much.
Many thanks, Jeff. Many thanks, Nuno, for your welcome remarks. And again, for colleagues who missed it at the beginning, my name's Rob. I'll be introducing the DSEG, kind of the group and the initial concept today, before passing over for some to my colleagues for the demonstration. So a little bit about the group before we kind of go into details about the tool. So as Nuno mentioned, we initiated this group very informally in the summer of 2018, and it was made up of like-minded kind of stakeholders working with humanitarian data, whether it's from kind of the data science teams, humanitarian program teams, colleagues in academic research, or more on the ethics side. But it was all really to discuss the potentials, the concerns, the challenges, the opportunities of how to use humanitarian data, but with a particular lens on the applying it with more advanced data science methods. So we really aim to kind of convene a diverse voices to create a multidisciplinary understanding of the ethical issues when it comes to humanitarian data science. And to draw your eyes to the diagram on the right-hand side of the screen, this is not an easy conversation, nor is it a individual conversation. It's a mixture of multiple. So in no particular order, it's there's components of data responsibility, including data security, data protection, data science ethics, but the more popular term is AI ethics. So we've kind of mentioned it there. Humanitarian innovation concepts, so problem recognition, appropriate solution searching, trying to avoid techno-solutionism if we can, and humanitarian principles and standards. So the minimum standards and benchmarks that we as humanitarians operate from. So kind of if you put all those various disciplines together into a kind of a big net, then that's kind of how we saw the scope of the humanitarian DSEG kind of focus. And there's a wealth of principle documents out there on ethics, on whether humanitarian ethics, humanitarian principles, AI ethics. So we've really tried to not invent anything new, but really try and collate and just overlap the key principles from the various areas to make kind of tangible guidance for colleagues, ourselves, and for the community moving forward. So a little bit about the team. Well, an introduction to the team who will be hearing from Kate Dodgson, from Gretchen, myself, Rob, and Jack from the IOM side, and the kind of the two stakeholders are the two agencies kind of coordinating and developing some of the content. So a little bit of how we come to the initial concept of the decision tree, but it actually goes back a first step. In the first months of the group over the summer and the fall of 2018, we were doing mapping with the various different stakeholders of the various different disciplines of what are the opportunities and what are the risks when we're working with humanitarian data in more advanced ways. And there are an entire a wealth of different points were made, and you can access these on the minutes on the website. I've put the link in the chat. But the most overarching point to come in was peer review, or most importantly, the lack of it. So in the academic world, you know, models will be developed, literature will be, articles will be wrote, and it'll go through rigorous peer reviews, testing from from other stakeholders. I mean, that was a lacking in the humanitarian sector. And since kind of then, OCHA have developed a work stream on this, which is great to see. Another issue is accountability. Is it the data scientist building the algorithms that's accountable? Is it the donors funding the project? Is it the project manager who's trying to make their program more efficient by maybe automating certain aspects of it? So who is really accountable on it? And you know, is there really one person, or is it really kind of the project network? The communication, how do you communicate results to affected populations? You know, if aid went to one area, not another, because a model predicted that there was greater need there, how do you communicate that? How do you communicate these processes, I don't know, to supply chain staff if we're trying to order stock because we're forecasting this space might happen in order to stock warehouses prior to an event occurring? Inclusivity, how do we include affected populations in the process? How do we include different personnel of the program within the project? And transparency, how do you make these really complex processes, and where there's lots of data and it's being mosaic together and it's being models are applied, how do you just make that as transparent, as intuitive and understanding as much as possible? So you can see, so from the initial appetite for peer review, that was very much at the discussions at the beginning of 2019, was very much an appetite to have that kind of technical peer review, but it really become apparent that it's not just the technical, it's the technical, the ethical, and the practical considerations that need to be thought of, and that led to the publication of this framework that, as Jeff mentioned, we published in April of 2020, and I must thank all the contributing authors and who helped develop that. The framework is essentially chaptered as this, and there's 5 key stages, and it's no accident that we've listed stage 0 to 4 rather than 1 to 5, because we see stage 0, the first stage, fundamentals, not as a step, but as the foundation, and we build everything upon that. So we don't see it as step 1, we see it as step 0. And that is touching upon the kind of the principles and the key ethics components of this particular work. And then the second stage is problem recognition and solution exploration. So this is something that we could probably all do more of, is really like understanding the problem more so, recognizing the problem we're dealing with, and then trying to figure out an appropriate solution that may be applied to said problem. And is it, in this particular circumstance, is it some sort of AI automation, or is it not? Because if it's not, then we can kind of terminate the process there. So kind of step 0 and step 1 are not really applicable to data science. They're just applicable to kind of any good project development. And then the following steps of data journey, algorithms, and reliance on outputs is much more specific to a humanitarian data science project. But this was the kind of the 5 steps of the document that was published. And here we now transition to the decision tree. And what is a decision tree? So basically, this is a direct digital translation of the framework. We've all received emails, downloaded documents of principles or guidance, and they may be 50, 60, 70 pages long, and you put a bookmark in to read, and you may get through the first couple of pages, it's heavy. So we wanted to design a tool that would work in multiple different contexts. It can be translated literally, in English, French, Arabic, and so on. It's light, so it can work in low bandwidth contexts like South Sudan. And it's a process that will take teams through what we think are some of the most critical steps of a data science project to really make the project teams think about the steps. And here we've actually split the problem recognition and search for solution into 2 separate steps. And here a program team can enter the tree. Maybe a team has a very well thought out problem, and the solution is some sort of machine learning process to detect damaged houses from satellite image. So there they can enter the tree at step 3. However, we think that the fundamentals is necessary to always have a refresher, should we say? So teams entering the tree will always go through the fundamentals and then enter the tree at the particular step that they've picked. So again, this is how you do data science project. This is a facilitation tool to take teams through what we think is the critical steps that we authored in the framework, and we've turned into a process. So this is the schematic of how the decision tree works, and I'll pass over to my colleagues in a moment for the demonstration. But basically, if you enter at the fundamentals and go through all of the steps of the tree, I think there's around 67, 68 different steps. Then the idea is that, and with each step, if you feel that you need to know more about a certain step, then all of the resources, it's a collation of resources. We haven't invented anything new, as the demo will show, but it's designed to help teams critically think about the project cycle. And I'll leave that now there because the demonstration will go into more depth. But just we developed a beta version in August, and we got input of colleagues. And I just want to show the next kind of a few things we've added to the website. So this is just a print screen of the site. The site is in the chat. You can go in, you can create an account, and you can create a project. And this will be the project that will go through the decision tree process. So here you add a title, you can add a project description, and here you can tick the publish box, which means that once the project has gone through the decision tree, then a public page or portfolio will be on our resources page. So I'll explain that in a bit better in just a second. So we'll go through the tree, and this is the last page of the tree, and you get the rosette. You've gone through it. You've gone through the steps that you thought you needed to. You can skip them, yes or no, and then you get a status that is completed. And then if you ticked, and then here, some feedback we got was that if we could provide a completion certificate, because then if you're applying for particular AI for Good grants or humanitarian innovation grants, then this is a demonstration that you've thought through not all of the, but a lot of the critical steps that we feel as a community we've identified as key steps in the humanitarian data science project. And then here, this is what I was speaking about a moment ago with the bit here about the make public, is that once you've gone through the completion in the resources page, then a description of the project portfolio will be added here. So the primary goal of this tool is to it's essentially a risk mitigation tool that guides program teams through looking whether inception or exploring how to use data science for their work, and to go through the critical steps for it. But a byproduct of that is knowledge generation, and the more people that use the tool, the more people that make their kind of project description public, it will then build a program on the resources page. So even if you're not developing a particular humanitarian data science project, but you want to know who's using machine learning in satellite detection projects, then you'll be able to go on here, use the key tags and see which stakeholders are there to create a discussion. And one thing we noticed during it was quite disjointed in finding on who's doing what. So we thought, whilst program teams are using the tool for their own kind of risk mitigation processes, it really gives them a great opportunity to just build a community of practice as well as a nice byproduct. And that was one of the recommendations we got in the summer. And then just on that note, in terms of collaboration, I must thank the NetHope AI working group who were contributors to this, the information management working group in Geneva, as well as the 120 different stakeholders from various NGOs, UN, academia, policy, and private stakeholders. It was a 9-month process, and we hope now I'm going to pass over to my colleagues where we'll actually give a live demonstration of the tool, so you can see it. You can see it in practice.
At the beginning of the decision tree, you get to choose which stage of the data science project lifestyle you're at. This is so that more advanced projects can jump in at later stages. But regardless of which stage you select, you'll be taken through the fundamentals. In this demo, we're going to assume that the user is starting from scratch. So we'll select stage 1, which is I do not have a use case for my data science project. Now you'll see that it takes us to the fundamentals check, which we'll run quickly through. We'll begin by warning users that before starting a data science project, they should be familiar with basic AI ethics, humanitarian principles and ethics, data responsibility, human rights, and risk mitigation. And note that this fundamental stage, the purpose of it is to fill in any gaps of this requisite knowledge. So we'll click next. Now, the first question asks if you're familiar with basic AI ethics, such as bias and transparency. Now, assuming our user is completely new to AI, we're going to click no. The next page, therefore, takes the users to an AI ethics primer. And you can see there's a table there, which we've included different types of AI potential harms, why it can happen. We've also included some extra resources in there that have further readings if you want to know more about this topic. So we'll click next now, assuming that the user has read through that. The next question asks if they are familiar with humanitarian principles and ethics. For the sake of brevity in this demonstration, we're going to assume that our user is a humanitarian that is well versed in these. So we're going to click yes, and that will skip us through the primer. So next page asks if we have responsible data management practices at their organization. Now, assuming the person is either unsure or doesn't, we'll select no. And again, we're taken to a primer on data responsibility, which includes selected resources to responsible data frameworks, which the person can use for their project. Now, again, assuming they've read through this, they will click next. And we're going to make a couple more assumptions. This is the beginning of stage 1, and this is for users who have not yet identified a use case for data science. And click next. Now, over the next few stages, you're going to see that we put a number of warnings in about proceeding with data science. You'll see on this page that the first thing we do is provide a warning that humanitarian problems should not be addressed with a technology solution first. Problems should always be identified on a needs basis. So after reading this warning, you can then click next. And on the next page, we provide an explanation as to how to undertake this problem recognition stage, how you can do a needs assessment first. And we provide links to tools and resources which can help with this stage. For example, ELRA's Humanitarian Innovation Guide. So we'll click next now. And the decision tree assumes that you've read this advice, that you've gone through the problem recognition stage, and that you have come up with a use case for data science. If that is the case, you can then click proceed. And as you've seen, you've just completed stage 1, and it takes you to stage 2, which is the data science suitability. We'll click next. So first of all, in checking whether or not data science is a suitable technology for you to use for your use case, We're going to ask if your problem would benefit from automation. So assuming our user isn't sure, we're going to click no. We then ask if the problem that you're facing, your use case, would benefit from other data science advantages such as speed or accuracy. Now, assuming our user still isn't sure or the answer is no, we're going to click no. And here you'll see our first, and admittedly currently only, warning not to pursue data science. We explain that if you're not going to harness the main benefits of data science, then you really shouldn't be pursuing it. And this is actually a topic which we're going to discuss with our expert panel later on. Should there be more red lines, more warnings, more do not proceeds? Just for the sake of the demo, we're going to click back so that we can continue on the decision tree. And let's assume that our user has decided that their problem would indeed benefit from something such as speed or accuracy. So we'll click yes. Now, the next few questions are about collaborations, which we're going to skip through just because this is a demo and we want to keep this quick. So we'll click yes. We'll click next and next again. And you'll see that we've now completed stage 2. We will be moving on to stage 3, which is the data check. But I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Gretchen Burman, who is the data scientist on the DSEG team, and she will run you through the data check stage and the algorithm check stage.
Thanks so much, Kate. So now that we've run through the data science suitability stage, we move on to the data check stage. And basically the data check stage investigates data collection from a variety of perspectives, including protection protocols, communication with affected populations, consent, and related topics. So we'll click next. And this brings us to existing data. So as the data science team, you're responsible for having an awareness of the existing landscape in terms of data that's related to the project that you're undertaking. So let's say that we're not sure what the landscape is right now, and we click no. We've included here a few resources for you to help start the process of understanding the landscape, but we want to emphasize how important it is to understand what other similar and related projects are out there already before you embark on your data science project to avoid any redundancies. So we click next here. And our next question asks if it's necessary to collect data yourself, so primary data. So let's assume that for this project, it is necessary for us to collect data. This brings us to the responsible data collection phase of the data check. So the next questions will ask us about finding strategies for building a foundation for responsible data collection. So the first thing that we talk about here is consent plans. So we ask if your data collection process includes clear, informed consent plans and processes. So let's assume that we're not really sure. We talk about this a lot in the humanitarian world, but often this is a step of data collection that doesn't get all of the attention that it deserves. So here we have sort of some beginning thoughts for having a discussion with your team about forming a plan for informed consent. How we develop consent plans is as critical as having them in the first place. So here's some just brief guidelines and resources about consent plans. And I think this would be a good moment to stop and emphasize that the purpose of this stage and really the whole decision tree is not to tell you what we think is the correct way to approach things. We're not trying to tell you what the right way is. Rather, we want to guide users through the resources and facilitate the discussions among teams about what is the correct approach and what resources might be helpful. So here we have links also to IOM Data Protection Manual, the ICRC Handbook on Data Protection, and also JPAL's sort of template for intake and consent processes. So we click next, and our next question is asking about data sufficiency. So this section asks you to investigate and talk with your team about whether or not you're able to achieve the sample size that you would need for the model that you're considering. Another sort of lesser known topic of discussion, but that's also important to think about, is whether or not you need to collect less data. So if over collecting data might expose vulnerable populations. in a way that isn't necessary. So this is another slide just to help understand the existing sort of data landscape and to start conversations with your team about important aspects. So let's click yes here. And this brings us to the bias check. So this is a really critical component of the data check section. And as you can see, there's quite a long table here that enumerates sort of the different types of biases that you might have in your data collection journey. So it's important to understand how bias in data collection exists outside of sort of bias in models, and also how these different types of biases interact with each other in the data collection stage. So take a moment to peruse this table. We have some resources here at the bottom also. And let's assume that you do have an understanding and you've reviewed and categorized all of the different potential types of bias in your project. So we click yes here. So this brings us to our next slide. So basically, most data sets are biased in some way. It's up to you as the architect of both data collection and the model to understand what types of biases exist and how to mitigate them. So this section of the tree just encourages you to make a plan to mitigate and be clear about the limitations of your data based on the biases that you've discovered. So we click next. And this brings us to the protection and processing section. So basically, this section of the data check emphasizes that robust data protection and management policies are essential for both primary data collection and stages beyond that. So starting with a robust foundation for data protection will help you as you start to work with both models and the outputs of that model. So we click next here. So the first thing we come to in this section of data check is team diversity. And I think this is a really important place to just pause and have a discussion with the stakeholders of this project to think about how we talk about representation both in the data collection process and in the data science team. So let's say that you and your team are unsure if you're properly represented or this is a topic you want to explore more. We could click no. And this just sort of prompts you and whoever else is doing this tree with you on your team to have a discussion about the importance of representation both in data collection and in data processing. So this goes for both representation in your team, in the team you build, and in your audience. Your team is a key component when building a worthwhile data science tool and in your ability to present that tool coherently and fairly to a diversity of audiences. So we can click next here, and this brings us to data storage management and anonymization. So just for the sake of time, let's say that these are tools that you already have in place for your data science project. And that similarly, you also have internal security measures in place. So the next one is unintended consequences. I think it's really critical for data science teams to make a document that sort of considers alternative and unintended impacts. So maybe that's your data collection has created complications in intergroup dynamics of the surveyed population, or maybe you're contributing a new data set that might have the potential to be used with a different data set in a sort of mosaic effect type situation that would create vulnerabilities where there weren't any before. It's really important to just sort of outline these things in a way that is clear and transparent as we move through the process. So let's say that we have thought about these, we do have this document. We are taken to the testing and evaluation stage. So let's say we do have a testing and evaluation method. And we have failure mechanisms for our data, so strategies that address possible inaccuracies or potential harms that result from our data processing. So if we click yes here, that takes us to the end of the data check stage. So this is all of the issues related to data collection and data processing. So the next stage is the algorithm check. And you might see some redundancies here from the data check stage. And I just want to emphasize that while some subjects may seem similar, issues like bias affect data and models in completely ways. And so it's important to consider them again as we move into the next phase. So again, here, like with, you may notice a pattern here with our phases. We have some tools that might help you familiarize yourself with how to gauge the impact and fairness of bias in your algorithms and models. So these are really great to check out. If we click next here, it takes us to a question about whether or not we're using machine learning. So let's, for the sake of this demonstration, let's say that we are. So here we can bias of the tree, and this bias is really talking about how machine learning specifically perpetuates bias. So especially, due to sort of like repetitive nature of machine learning, bias can be perpetuated in a lot of different ways here. So for example, biased sexist or biased algorithms are only objective in the sense that they have sort of objectively encoded the structural bias of the processes that created them. So this is sort of something to discuss with your team. Again, these are sort of core issues that we thought would be really important. And then again, resources at the bottom for this. So bias feedback loops are sort of a component of what we were talking about before. So understanding the impact of redundancies and repetitive analysis in machine learning. So let's say that we don't have that in our machine learning algorithm for this demonstration. This takes us to model specifications. So this page should be familiar to most data scientists, but it's important to incorporate sort of routine technical checks into the processes of this decision tree in order to sort of have a more holistic view of the project from an ethical perspective. So this also has some tools, but this includes things like formal verification and robustness checks. So as we are a bit short on time, I'll say, let's say that for this project, we have successfully undertaken a validation test. So this brings us to accuracy and explainability. So this really gets at sort of the trade-off between having a robust model that is really difficult to explain to stakeholders and having a really, really simple model that's not particularly robust and maybe even a little bit unfair to certain vulnerable populations, but that stakeholders or outside partners really understand. And so this section of the tree really encourages you to investigate sort of the balance between those two things and determining whether a white or black box model for your algorithm is suitable. So we can click next here. And that brings us to transparency. And this section is really more about creating a very clear record of every single decision and action that's been made from sort of the data check stage to the algorithm stage. Have you documented and justified your decisions for making this model in a way that would be clear to somebody else if they came in and joined your team? So let's say that we have done this. This brings us to consent and accessibility. And this consent page is different from the previous one in that now we're talking about how do we bring in all of the people and the populations that are necessarily affected by our algorithm, either directly or indirectly? And how do we allow people to understand the ways that they are involved in the algorithm and how that impacts both sort of individuals and also populations as a whole? And how can people access this, right? So if you are part of the surveyed population, what happens next? There should be both an accessibility and a transparency here. So this is really connected to the previous section. So if we click next, we're taken to the last part of the algorithm check, which is scalability and sustainability. So if we could think about how busy we are and how limited our resources are in the humanitarian sector, it's really important to consider both, can this project and model be scaled? And is it sustainable? Or is this just a one-round survey with a model that was kind of cool at the time? And there are lots of reasons to do things like that, but it should be a part of the holistic approach to whether or not you undertake a project like this. And with that, I think thinking about sort of the long-term projections of the impacts of our both data collection and our algorithms, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague Prithvi, who will talk a little bit more about reliance on outputs and what we do once we finish building the model. So Prithvi, over to you.
Thank you, Gretchen. So after diving into the nature of the data science method itself, at stage 5, we kind of come a full circle. We return to the human in the loop. And at this stage, we want to think a bit more carefully, particularly on the newfound reliance on technology and its linked output. We also want to think a little bit more about the reliance on the output, particularly thinking about which humanitarian practitioners and actors will use this output. Could we click next, please? So at this stage, it is important to think about the output from 3 kind of main themes. The first one is the tolerance for errors. While all models might have limitations and errors as part of them, it is important to consider the impact of those errors. How best can they be minimized? What safeguards exist? And also at this stage, it's good to work with your tech to determine the level of risk that is acceptable. Some calculation combining frequencies, for example, of say the injury or the severity of injury, for example. So at this stage, we'll assume that we have determined our tolerance for errors and click next. Thank you. Okay, this brings us to the question, the second component, which is accountability. Accountability makes us think about, does the output or technology improve or impede accountability to affected populations or those that this project is intended to help? Will people be affected by these tools, and will they have any recourse or right of appeal as a result of this? And in this sense, it is important at this stage to think about whether or not there are independent third-party monitoring mechanisms that are inbuilt into the project. What are the broader implications of things such as predictions as a result of the output, and so on. Here we will assume that we don't have an accountability framework and click no. As you can see, I deliberately brought you to this page because I want to emphasize that this decision tree is a living tool. It is a resource that we want to build together. And at this stage, accountability frameworks are especially important to build and include, particularly when we're thinking about the different outputs that we want to create. And in that sense, we envision that this process will change and evolve. For example, if this becomes a potential stage 6 in another decision tree or a newer version of the decision tree. Let's click next. Finally, the third component of this stage on reliance on outputs is that of responsibility. Building on accountability, we come to the question of how can responsibility be shared between the humanitarian agency, the program lead, and the data scientist. It is important here to think about how will this responsibility and a reliance on output be managed between the various actors that are involved. Who will be in the position to catch problems? Here we'll assume that we thought about shared responsibility. Further guidance is also provided in the Alan Turing report, which provides overall a comprehensive understanding of thinking about the various actors and the roles that are necessary to consider for an ethical implication. Let's click next. Another tool that we highly recommend is thinking about peer review. Peer review is an important step in the direction to support mutual learning, as well as building a humanitarian community that uses data science. Let's click yes. Here we reach the final stage of the decision tree, which basically is a post and pre-mortem ethical check. Here we allow the user to have a overall holistic reflection on the ethical issues that may arise at the different stages. Moreover, it also forces us to think about the responsibility we have in perpetuity. That is the institutional knowledge that we build that outlives a particular program and goes back to the question that Gretchen referred to about the sustainability and scalability of projects. Finally, it is important to emphasize that these are just methods that we use and we can use to mitigate ethical challenges that may arise, but they do not necessarily fix them all. That is a continual and evolving process that we have to together build.
Well, there we go. So apologies if there was any glitches in that. We're working across multiple different countries, so we just so that was a bit of a pre-recording in case we had any server issues. I'm sure everyone's been online at some point over the last 7 months, and there'd be a technical glitch. So it was pre-recorded as a safeguard. However, I will recommend colleagues to go into the chat to get the links to the websites, and really just play around with it yourself. And please, any recommendations, just email the team. That there's the contact box on the website, so we can really kind of learn more and tweak and edit as we go on. I would now like to reintroduce introduce the next part of the session, which is the panel. And I would reintroduce Professor Virginia Dignum, the Wallenberg Chair on Responsible AI at Umeå University, Adam Lang, the head of Nesta Scotland, and Cecilia Jimenez Damary, the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights of Internally Displaced Persons, IDPs. So if the colleagues are all online, so I will, nice to see you, Cecilia. So upon drafting the guidance and doing the work, the research, we found, probably not exaggerating, tens to hundreds, well, definitely tens, almost hundreds of different kind of principles documents for the various kind of different disciplines and areas that we're kind of sees the scope within the DSEG. And the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative has done an excellent kind of mapping of the different kind of principle frameworks and ethics frameworks on AI. But this is kind of a bit of a $1 million question, and I'm gonna point this probably more to Virginia at the beginning. But how do you go about translating principles into practical guidance?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction and for inviting me to participating in this important initiative today, and congratulations for the launching of the tool. Indeed, that is the $1 million question, and is the question that we really need to start addressing at this moment. It is relatively easy to agree on high-level principles and recommendations for how we want AI to be introduced in our lives and to be affecting our lives. It is a much harder issue to be able to agree and to understand how to translate these principles of fairness, of the inclusion, of non-discrimination, of privacy, of transparency, and so on, into concrete steps for the ones who are developing and who are using this type of systems. And I think that you guys have done a very, very good effort and work on the decision tree that you just presented. I think that the most important issues in this area is to consider first, to understand that different people, different regions, different sectors have different needs and different requirements concerning what AI and how AI should be implemented. So the first question we really need to address in this type of processes is AI the technology that we really should be using in this type of problem? So this is really a basic zero level question. Without answering this question, we are mostly addressing a technological solution without often not even thinking about what the real problem is. So we really have to address the question, should we be using AI here? And then to address and to answer this question, we really need to take a participatory approach. We really need to take into account the different stakeholders, the different disciplines, the different contexts and realities in which the systems or the solutions are potentially going to be used. So I think these are the two main issues to start with. Being aware of whether or not using an AI, a data-oriented solution in a certain issue, and then addressing this question from a participatory and inclusive way.
Many thanks, Virginia, and I'll point towards Adam from Nesta now, and with the experience that kind of Nesta does on kind of technology governance. Who, in terms of stakeholders, who would need to be in these types of conversations?
Hi, yeah, thank you very much. And just to echo the thanks for inviting me to be part of this today. The tool was fantastic to see, and this is already a great conversation. I think your question is a great question. In Scotland, we're currently grappling with developing an AI strategy for Scotland, and what it means to do exactly as you say, and as Virginia mentioned as well. How do we put citizens at the heart of that strategy? How do we put engagement and empowerment and awareness at the heart of any strategy to deploy more and better AI in Scotland? And I don't think anyone's necessarily getting this fully right. I certainly know that we're learning as we go. But one of the things I think is important, and that we've built into the process in Scotland, which we're part of, is a fairly comprehensive mapping of the ecosystem, because I think that's really important for a couple of reasons. I think when you look at the ecosystem, you have to understand who the players involved in AI development are. Also who the players are in the sort of functional use of AI, and then ultimately who the target audiences or customers or sections of the public that the AI tool is seeking to support or help or impact upon. And that's a significant exercise. You know, it covers academia, it covers businesses, it covers the public sector, the voluntary sector, and often groups that are hard to map in that way as well, in terms of the end users or the end beneficiaries. So it's not an easy task, but it is absolutely a critical task to do upfront, I think, when you're thinking about a comprehensive mapping of the stakeholders. And what I would just sort of briefly say in relation to that is, ethics in AI is the sort of topic of the day, rightly so. It's an incredibly important issue. But I think when we think about, you know, what does it really mean? It's sometimes hard to, because everybody wants to find a thing, you know, a singular thing that they can point to say this is good ethics, you know, this is. But you know, as has been said by others, it's so context relevant or context sensitive. You know, it means different things to different places, different people, different communities. That it's really, that mapping is done. You can have different contexts and understand them, and I think it's also linked to culture. You know, a good AI, ethical AI ecosystem is one where you have those softer values in the culture about how people are educated about AI, from schools through colleges, through universities, through their work life, and just in their personal lives, all the way through to the professional side. You know, do the businesses you attract to your location, are they the right kind of businesses? And these are hard and difficult things. But yeah, a bit of a rambling answer, I apologise. But just to say, I think it's an incredibly important question, that idea of mapping comprehensively and well the stakeholders that you need, because there's a lot of them.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree. I couldn't agree with you more, and particularly on the mapping. And when we were developing the framework at the beginning, you know, really understanding who's doing what, with say data science in the humanitarian sector. We knew a number of the kind of the key players, but we didn't know everyone, and that's what we thought one of the primary goal of the tool was to really the risk mitigation. But if people are doing that, could we also, as the byproduct, create the kind of the project portfolio in the library, so the mapping is easier for when such mapping, because for the mapping exercises. So there's a bit of a, we know where to go to kind of find where, not everything, but where a good chunk of stakeholders are working with, hopefully, who are doing this. But it's also a place to kind of highlight your project work on this to support any mapping exercises. So I couldn't agree with you more, and that kind of chain of thought was some of the reasons why we kind of went that way as well with the revamp of the decision tree. And Cecilia, I mean, this question is obviously for you, but when principles get kind of translated into guidance documents, it's I mean, how do you best ensure kind of the human rights of the kind of, in this particular case, affected the populations, but the people who will be involved in this process? How do you ensure the human rights are represented? Cecilia, I think you're still on mute.
So I am. It's one of the most often repeated. So first of all, thanks for the invitation, Rob, and to everybody who are involved in this, and also thanks to Jeff for the concern. The hurricane has been devastating, and a lot has to be done. I should say that question is obviously for me, but let me just say that with regard to the protection of the human rights, and of course I speak about the application within the context of internally displaced persons. Jeff has mentioned the development of data, including on IDPs, has developed over the past decade. And as the document mentioned, on the other hand, the technological developments have overpassed policy and ethical considerations. Human rights standards, I must say, have not really caught up adequately. But having said that, human rights standards, in a way, have been only stuck at merely monitoring the implications of these technological developments on existing fundamental human rights standards, which of course should be applied. But what I'm saying here is that in order to ensure that human rights are represented, we do need the involvement of more human rights experts, advocates, in the discourse of developing human rights application to data, to AI, etc. And this is going on, but we do need more of that, and we do need more discourse. Naturally, on the part of the humanitarians, the practitioners, I would always go for awareness and training. For example, what does consent and privacy mean according to human rights standards? It's easy to tick the box. It's easy to say, oh yes, I know about consent, etc. We've discussed about it. But what would be the criteria to ensure that you do know what consent means according to the privacy laws of the country, which the document mentions, and according to international standards. And I also want to say that human rights, in this sense, should be seen to be applicable in all the contexts. And it's not just something that, oh, it's such a bother, because we are dealing with people. I like the way that the decision tree, the framework, has actually said that it's not technology that should be determinant, but it should be the needs. And of course, the needs should be based on human rights. At the same time, there is an overlap. Application should be definitely be taken practice in accordance with other international legal regime. I'm a lawyer, so I'm very adamant about this. And particularly when, for example, a humanitarian situation is within is within an armed conflict context, then it's not just human rights per se that apply. It's also international humanitarian law. And I know that our colleagues in the International Committee of the Red Cross are also developing many of their thoughts and the application of IHL to AI, for example. In certain contexts, it may be important to also look at customary law. It depends, of course, on the suitability, but sometimes it also helps to actually apply that human rights, in this context to the situation. Last but not the least, I would like to insist that it's not just the practitioners, the policymakers that should be, in a way, aware of this decision tree, or at least the principles therein, but the internally displaced persons themselves, affected population, should know their rights and how they will be in the position to actually advocate and maintain those rights. The concept of IDP participation should be in an active mode and not merely subject. I think it's important that human rights is represented also with regard to the participation of the IDPs. And of course, as already mentioned, other stakeholders, depending on the context, should be involved.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. And this kind of goes into the next kind of topic quite well, is that so we saw from the decision tree presentation the discussion of like Kate presented like a do not proceed slide and a dead end, should we say? And it was the only dead end in the decision tree that we could think of, and that's something we called the red line, because I think that's a popular term for this. But we debated we debated a lot on kind of if one was enough, if one was too many, because who are we to say you should do this and you shouldn't do that? It's really just a facilitation tool, and we're trying to make people's lives easier by just having all the critical documentation in a not a chronological order, but in a logical order. And we appreciate that the process we demonstrated isn't the process that everyone will go through, but we had to build the architecture of the system in some way. So when it comes, and Cecilia, if you don't mind, I'll put you back onto the spotlight. But when it comes to, say, applying data science methods in the kind of the humanitarian sector, like what would be some of the key red lines or dead ends that you think are the obvious ones, apart from the fact if AI isn't going to help it, don't do it?
Yeah. Well, I think if you are going to apply the data processes on a certain population, let's say an IDP population, I think the factors that should be integrated into these red lines should be, first of all, specific rights that may be affected. But I would like to insist, of course, that IDP populations are by themselves not monolithic. Within the IDP population, of course, everybody has to have the right to life, the right to security, as you have actually flagged them, etc. Very well, actually. But within the IDP population, there are also certain rights of specific groups. For example, children. Children have more rights in a way under international human rights law, and a lot of countries, of course, except one, have ratified. All the countries except one have ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And for children, there is a special affirmative protection that is provided to them, and also the best interest determination. So these things should automatically be integrated in terms of the different rights of specific diverse groups. Another one would be persons with disabilities. And then one thing I think also that should be looked at, and this is with regard to compliance. There is always a risk, and it's a risk because we're talking about human rights, that the compliance is merely on quantity rather than quality, and how that should be monitored and checked should be internally applied. Application of the decision whether to proceed or not, or at what stage this should be done, should at least have internal checks as well as in collaboration with relevant colleagues. And of course, always red lines, aside from potential unintended consequences, and sometimes even intended, we do need to develop, to generate transparency, also have feedback mechanisms, and as you already pointed out, the risk mitigation mechanisms should be really taken seriously. And last but not the least, the factors that should be integrated here is maintaining that implementation continues to be in line with existing international guidelines. We have a lot of humanitarian guidelines that are actually based on human rights. And I know that the work that you have done have considered all this. But one guideline that I think is important, that's very recent, is of course the guidelines on localization. Because here you will find the added obligation, in a way, of humanitarian practitioners to ensure the ownership and involvement of the local assistance providers. So I'll stop there for the moment.
No, it's really nice to hear you speak about this. And for Professor Dignum, with your kind of expertise in AI ethics, do you have any insight into kind of whether in this sector or elsewhere on how kind of regulation of kind of standards have been done, and who should be and who would normally do that?
Thank you very much, and I fully agree with the examples and the recommendations that Cecilia just described. In terms of regulation, there are a few very concrete examples. Most of the ones I'm aware of are regional or country-based, and one of the most known for everybody is, of course, the European regulations on data protection. So the GDPR regulations is a very concrete regulation, and really binding regulation around use and management of data. But I think that when we talk about responsibility in AI, about AI ethics, is not just about regulation. It's really about what I would call soft regulation or self-regulation, in which the parties involved really have the responsibility to also understand and decide for themselves when and how they want to use and apply this type of systems. Concerning red lines and so there are standards, and there are several standards being developed both at the level of ISO, but also the IEEE, the International Engineering Association, are working on standards. Again, these are at this moment recommendations, are not binding, but they do give support to those who want to be assured in somehow that what they are doing is aligned and it's been thought of. But when we talk about red lines, I think the most important, so you indicate in your decision tree, if you don't if AI is not going to be beneficial, then you don't use it. But the other extreme, or the other side of that coin, is if AI is going to be problematic, then you shouldn't also not use it. So you should really look at impact of what you are doing. And of course, if we are using AI to provide recommendations on what is the best movie to watch tonight or what book to read, the impact in our lives is rather than a boring evening or whatever. It's not really very serious. But when we really are using AI in ways that impact populations, that impact individual lives and their decisions and their futures, we really need to ask ourselves the question, do we have the processes and institutions in place that can deal with the cases in which it goes wrong? If we don't have this, and AI will go wrong, like any technology, it it has the potential to go wrong, to do things either by mistake or by insight. Things might go wrong, so we really need to ask ourselves, do we have the institutions, do we have the processes in place to deal in a humanitarian, in a human rights way with the cases in which it might go wrong? And that, I think, it's for me a red line. For if you don't have these things, you really need to consider, think twice or 3 times or 10 times about, should I be using AI in these cases?
Yeah, no, I think you make a great point. It's not just about if you have the capacity to use it. It's about if it will create. We're all trying to. How we structured the tree was about applying a certain technology to solve as a solution to a problem, and if the solution makes the problem even bigger, then that's a pretty obvious red flag. So great.
And of course, the question is this the correct solution or the best solution for the problem?
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Considering other options is also should be part of the process. And in many cases, that might be that AI might not be in all cases the best solution, either because we don't have the sufficient data or because it will impact people in ways that affect further their options later than if you don't use AI. So we really need to take those things into account.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really nice to hear you say this, because the initial structuring of the framework and then the translation into the tree was really figuring out, like, this stage one, what is the problem? What is the solution? Is it going to make our lives easier? Is it going to make it more complicated? And that is kind of where the original kind of dead end red flag come about. But as you say, there can be multiple more along the process as well. So yeah, it's great to hear you say this. And Adam, based on your role with Nesta and kind of with the AI policy in Scotland, as you mentioned, and something that our colleague Kate had kind of been part of as well, is how, in your experience, what are the roles of the governments? I'm kind of biased towards the humanitarian, so I'd also think kind of UN, NGOs, but maybe they may be less prominent in Scotland, but kind of with civil society, and as well as the relationship with kind of the big tech sectors actually developing the technology and the algorithms, or who have ownership over the data.
Yeah, it's so I think there's a really important role for NGOs or civil society, charities, whatever the correct term is, but for the sector. And part of it, I think, is linked to this idea, which others have talked about as well, this sort of concept or conversation around data justice. This idea of how do we grapple with these ethical, rights-based, justice, fairness issues around data and AI. And I think, organisations like NGOs and charities and voluntary groups have a great culture that can be brought in those areas, or a great value set that can be brought into and alongside the private sector or academia to enhance the development of AI. And it's something we've done a little bit of this in Scotland. We've run a small grant fund for social uses of AI in Scotland to kind of profile them, understand them, and support their work. And what's been quite interesting about that is lots of the projects that applied for the funding and that we ended up backing are collaborations with voluntary organisations. So it's for example, it could be a satellite company that's working with an NGO focused on environmental issues to map biodiversity decline in parts of Scotland. Just one example of many. But we've been really interested by this work and by the benefits to all parties when you incentivize businesses working with NGOs, because it helps everybody as we're all learning about how to use and deploy and build these tools and these technologies. And I think so that's a really important part for me of the point I was making earlier, I suppose, about the ecosystem and the culture and the values that underpin how you as a country or as a sector or as an industry perhaps might go about developing deploying, using AI and AI tools. So I think it's hugely important. I think, and I think, I hope that the NGOs and charities and voluntary organisations can stay active and involved in this space, because I think they've got enormous potential and benefit to bring to the table when we're talking about AI. It shouldn't just be, and it isn't just big business or big companies or big governments that should be involved in this. There's a lot of potential for social good across a range of sectors.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. And kind of going on to the last kind of theme of the panel, and this is something that is kind of very close to my heart, is kind of responsible innovation. Like, how do we move forward? It's 2020, but how do we do it in a safe and responsible way that is applicable to the various kind of contexts that we work in? So Adam, I'm gonna throw this one back to you. So a little bit kind of why I'm asking this question is that I have a tech background, but I've spent pretty much my entire professional career in humanitarian contexts, and I kind of deal with this a lot in my head, but also in discussions. And I've been in many of these discussions, and they can become quite polarized about tech, and it can be like pro tech or no tech. And with AI, it's kind of very much like, it's quite a polarizing topic. And so basically, how do we ensure kind of innovation and accountability? Like, how do we kind of innovate, but yet realize the risks of this technology? And how do we maximize our accountability to the populations that we're here to serve?
Yeah, I think if I had a great answer for that, I would be a more successful and wealthier man than I am. Because I think it's a really topical issue, and it's one that, again, loads of people are grappling with this. But if I could reframe it a little bit in terms of how I view it, I think this is about inclusive innovation for me, and I think that's about. And these are points that others on the panel have made as well, much more eloquently than me. But the idea around, do we have the right structures, the right processes to include people at all stages in the development of AI, but also technology and data-driven innovation more generally? Are we just talking to ourselves in our own echo chambers of academia or business, or even in voluntary organizations, NGOs? Are we just talking to like-minded people? How are we all as practitioners and professionals pushing ourselves, pushing our organizations, reaching out to engage with the communities we seek to support or seek to have as beneficiaries from the things, the technologies of AI that we're developing? And also, how are we working with governments? This is something for example, in Scotland is really important, because government have a very important role, both at a national level, international and local level, because they're one of the few institutions that have the ability at scale to sort of get their arms around these problems and to put in place the infrastructure, to put in place the processes. And it's not always about legislation. Sometimes it's about, I think legislation is important, don't get me wrong, but it's not always about legislation. I think there's other ways of working. And in Scotland, we talk about a thing called the Scottish approach to service design, which is trying to bring service design methodologies and principles, which are well known, alongside cultural values from Scotland about inclusion, about user voice, participation, etc. And that's just an example. It's not the answer. There's it's a work in progress very much, but it's an example of trying to embed cultures alongside institutions, alongside working practices, because I don't think any one thing, I don't think there's any silver bullet to inclusive innovation. I think it's a continual challenge, because challenges around inclusion change. I mean, we've got very different challenges, for example, right now living in a pandemic lockdown situation, about inclusion. So how do we learn all the time and have this continual loop of improvement?
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. And that comes back as well. It's not just about legislation; it's also about the culture, which I think you mentioned in your second point. But Cecilia, I mean, I kind of asked Adam quite an unfair question, because it's a very big question. But do you have any kind of complementing thoughts on what was said? on I imagine from a kind of how do we innovate and how do we be accountable, but obviously coming back to the how do we protect the rights of of the people that we're trying to we may implement a project with enhanced efficiency to get aid quicker, but how do we kind of make sure we're protecting the rights of those people whilst exploring with innovative methods?
Okay, so I've already spoken about internal checks, transparency mechanisms, etc. But how to push this more? I think that within the human rights and humanitarian domain, I think there should be further discourse, research on accountability, on responsibility and accountability. And of course, we have to include the affected populations as well on that. In human rights, it's usually the state that is responsible for human rights obligations. And sometimes we get stuck there. And of course, the role of government is very important. In your framework, you actually, for example, one of the examples you brought out was the role of Canada and AI. And I think that is quite correct, that the state should be should be an entity that should be part and parcel of this discourse, particularly on responsibility and accountability. But it is also clear that over time, other actors have responsibility and obligations as well that mimic human rights obligations of states. Of course, we can always start at the level of the humanitarian assistance providers, but that's easy because we talk to each other, and I think we do need to have make each other accountable for this. But I also would like to bring up the important issue of upstream responsibility and accountability. For example, how far it's like talking about supply chains, but in this particular case, in this context, how far should donors have responsibility and accountability? What about non-state actors, including technical providers, business, considering the fact that that in the human rights domain, business is now considered to be very important for in implementing human rights and in not violating human rights. So the discourse needs to continue. And of course, we should advance not just a discourse, but actually an understanding as to how such responsibility and accountability can be implemented. And that would be in relation to a combination of decision makers, providers, and practitioners. And in that sense, I would say that we can actually not only ensure a rights-based approach, but advance it with what you call the future adoptions of AI systems.
Yeah, wonderful. And Professor Dignum, just to really close, you've got expertise in this, immense expertise in this. You recently were part of the UNICEF AI work that was published a couple of weeks ago. So as I imagine a lot of the audience will be from the humanitarian development sector, so to close the call, in your experience and your expertise, does this particular community have any extra challenges to be aware of given the difficult operating context we work in, as well as the extremely vulnerable people we're trying to support?
Thank you for the question. I'm not really sure if you have special concerns. I think the concern should be for all of us. But I think that in your community, like in many other communities, the UNICEF, the children community, the issues related to people with disabilities and so on, you can really provide a good example and a good vision for the rest of us. It is often things, and you just asked previously, how do we innovate? And often innovation is seen as in opposition to human rights, to responsibility and trustworthiness in systems. And I think that in this sector, in the humanitarian sector, as in several other sectors, you really can show that it's not a choice. It's not like either we have innovation or we have responsibility. responsibility. We really need both, and we can, and you can show that, use human rights, use responsibility and trustworthiness as the stepping stone for innovation. It's from the perspective of the ones developing the technologies, the ones developing the algorithms. It's very easy to stay on the efficiency and optimizing for efficiency. And that is not the goal, and it cannot be the aim of AI in any of the applications that we are looking at. We really have to take human rights as the issue that we are optimizing for. It is not a choice between efficient AI and human right compliant AI. It's about having AI that is efficient for human rights, that is compliant with human rights, and that therefore we can trust and can be used in a responsible way. So I think that it's kind of, you can show the rest of the developers, the ones in a more commercial or more research settings, that we can really bring these two things together, and by bringing them together we really develop a different approach to AI and a different approach to data oriented technology that really can support and facilitate and enhance human rights across all types of population.
That was a brilliant, that was an exceptionally powerful answer to I think appropriately close the launch. I'm going to say no more on the content just because I wouldn't want to butcher what you said, but I will take the time to thank the panelists, Professor Virginia Dignum, Adam Lang, and Cecilia Jimenez Damary for your brilliant contribution, and to all the participants that have been involved for the last 90 minutes. I hope the concept of the DSEG and the decision tree is clear. We can only do so much with a 20-minute video, so we'll share the link. Just log on, play around, and again, if I think the best way to hopefully improve this process is through collaboration. So please sign up, engage. If you think we need to develop a branch this way or another route this way, then it's an open forum, it's a multidisciplinary forum, and hopefully as a community we can kind of try and cover some of the key discussions that Adam, Virginia, and Cecilia kind of covered, and hopefully what we've also tried to cover in our own framework. But yeah, it's been a real pleasure to speak to you all today. Honestly, it really has. And and in 2020, I can't leave a meeting without saying, hope everyone stays well and healthy. And many thanks for everyone's time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.